But Reagan promised the nation good times, so he gave all his rich buddies and funders tax cuts and then put $2 trillion on the nation's credit card. Reagan borrowed and spent in just 8 years more money than every president of the United States from George Washington to Jimmy Carter combined. And now the Republicans don't want to pay the bill for Reagan's debt because the bill has come due. No, we're not going to pay that. We want you to cut Social Security to pay it. Then George Herbert Walker Bush came along and kept running up the nation's credit cards. So by the time he left office 4 years later, he'd added another $1.5 trillion to the credit card bill. And today the Republicans don't want to pay off Herbert Walker's debt either. That's 2 Republican presidents in a row, blowing up our national debt from just under $1 trillion to over $4.3 trillion in just 12 years. And the Republicans don't want to pay off that debt unless they can kill Social Security in the process. Then Bill Clinton came into office, raised taxes on the rich, slowed down the growing national debt, and even though he added on another $1 trillion to the national debt by the time he left office in 2001, he had our nation running a budget surplus. And we were poised to pay off our entire national debt, all that money that Ronald Reagan and Herbert Walker had put on the credit card in just 10 years by 2010. Had Al Gore got elected, we would have no debt right now. Actually, Al Gore was elected. So here we have 2 Republicans, Reagan and Bush Sr., running up a huge debt, and a Democrat, Bill Clinton, figuring out a way to pay it off. Then George W. Bush gallops into town. And like Reagan, Bush promises his billionaire funders and his family friends, his multimillionaire family friends, people like him, that he's going to cut taxes again for them. And to give himself a shoo-in victory in 2004, he started 2 wars. And he paid for all that stuff the same way Reagan paid for it and the same way Herbert Bush had paid for it, by putting it on the national credit card. It took Bush 1 year to turn Bill Clinton's budget surplus into a budget deficit. So after 8 years in the White House, George W. Bush took the $5.7 trillion debt he inherited from mostly Reagan and his dad and turned it into a $10.4 trillion heap of debt to hand over to President Obama with a nice little bonus gift of a Republican Great Depression. In total, George W. Bush added $4.5 trillion to the national debt. And Republicans don't want to pay off Bush's credit card bill either. So while Bush was piling on the debt, by the way, Republicans in Congress had no problem raising the credit limit, the debt ceiling. It's like calling up your credit card company. Right now my debt limit's only $5,000. Can you raise that to $10,000? Republicans did that 7 times while George Bush was president, raised the debt ceiling. In all, by the time President Obama took office in 2009, Reaganomics had jacked our national debt up by nearly $9 trillion, and nearly $8 trillion of that debt was courtesy of 3 Republican presidents. And this is what the so-called debt limit debate today is all about. This debate is not about out-of-control spending. It's not about big government under President Obama. In fact, President Obama, right now, there are 500,000 fewer government employees than there were the day that he came into office, mostly because in red states, Republican governors are laying government employees off, trying to crash the economy as hard and as fast as they can so that things will absolutely suck in 2012 so that President Obama will not get reelected. What this is really all about is Republicans not wanting to pay the bills their own guys ran up unless they get some goodies. Imagine what would happen if you ran up a huge credit card bill and then called up Citibank and said, I'm only going to pay you if you give me something I want. How do you think the police would take your offer to pay off your credit card bill only if the bank sent you and a dozen friends on an all-expenses-paid trip to Disneyland? But when Republicans ran up a $9 trillion debt, and now they don't want to pay it unless they get their wish list, have you noticed that the corporate media doesn't even mention how it all came about? Not a word about it. This is a crime. And if Republicans really are willing to crash our economy, and take a look, they're doing it, just to avoid paying off the bills run up by their own presidents, They should be charged with financial fraud and thrown in prison. And frankly, I think if the American people realized it in these very simple terms, they ran up this huge credit card bill, and now they don't want to pay it unless the rest of us agree to give up Social Security. If the American people realize this, now the media is going to do everything it can to make sure that we don't realize this, because then the elections in 2012 would be easy. The Democrats would win overwhelmingly. You wouldn't have a horse race. The media wouldn't have millions and millions of advertising dollars. You know, it just wouldn't be profitable for them. But anyhow, if the American people did realize it, the Republicans would never again be allowed to handle the nation's finances again. And to those Democrats who are too timid to call this theft from all of us what it is, intentional fraud. Not just intentional fraud. It even had a name. It had a logo. It was called Starve the Beast. That's what Reagan called the strategy. Those timid Democrats who won't stand up and say, you know, this debt belongs to Ronald Reagan, Herbert Bush, and G.W. Bush. And now their Republicans in Congress don't want to pay it. Those timid Democrats who are afraid to say that out loud, they deserve whatever the voters give them. And that's my biggest fear, frankly, is that the Republicans are going to succeed in this strategy that was laid out in 1976 by Jude Wanniski in his Two Santa Clauses Theory white paper. Later became, I read it in the Wall Street Journal years ago, decades ago. That the Democrats have always been Santa Claus. They have Social Security. They have unemployment. They have Medicare. Republicans need to become Santa Claus, too. So when we get into office, spend like drunken sailors. And then when the Democrats come into office, scream about the debt that the Republicans ran up.